Next up, we have a fireside chat, a feature discussion on a topic of creating trust in transactions with moderator Dr. Jane Thomason, CEO of Blockchain Quantum Impact, and speaker Brian Miller, EOSBC and Block.one. Give it up for our moderator and panelists.
Afternoon, everyone, and fantastic to be here with you in Hong Kong, and very excited to be having a fireside chat with my good friend and colleague, Brian Mailer from Block.one EOSBC team. So, did anyone get on Wikipedia and have a look at the word trust and try and figure out what that means? Hands up. Hands up if you really understand about trust and why trust is important in blockchain. Good, Sam knows, so just check in with him after the panel if we haven't clarified it. So you hear the term used all the time, blockchain, the trust machine. You hear about trustnology. You hear about web of trust being created around people's identities. What does that really mean, and why do we really believe that blockchain's going to be able to give us trust in transactions? And one of the things that I've seen in travelling around the world, and I work on blockchain and social impact in emerging economies, that's my big interest, is the increasing interest that we're seeing from governments and industry and international organisations about how blockchain is going to solve some of the big challenges that emerging economies are facing. So I just came from Indonesia. I flew in from Jakarta and got in this morning. The government of Indonesia is looking at using blockchain for cash transfers into remote Papua and West Papua province. So why do they believe that blockchain is going to give them that sort of trusted technology to be able to ensure that the cash transfers that they're sending to the poorest people in the country are going to get where they need to get and not have leakage on the way? So that's really the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about today, because in an environment of increasing complexity, with technology taking over every aspect of our lives, why is it that we're going to have trust in blockchain and transactions and see it as a critical feature in the new global economy? So I'm really happy to have Brian here to explain it, because I don't know. So I'm going to start off by saying to Brian, look, how does the lack of trust, so if we need trust, how does the lack of trust limit our ability to expand the global economy?
Sure. I want to start off by saying thank you for being here and joining me on this. Trust is a big issue that the VC team at Block.one has definitely been focusing on. We see that there's a lack of trust in doing the simplest of transactions. Most everyone has done an online purchase, whether it's with one of the payment systems or a third-party facilitator, and it's a small purchase you're making, but there's a lack of trust, and that lack of trust is a hurdle that's been in the place of mankind since all days past, where in order to do this, in order to clear that hurdle, you had to have trust. And if you look at taking Dorman's number of looking at, you can only have 150 people that you have close social interactions with, those are the only people you're going to trust, is 150. So anyone you're interacting with online is by default not trusted. And so when you have these non-trusted transactions, you usually bring in a middleman. Whether it's a payment processor, as I said, or another party for escrow accounts for larger transactions, you then have to pay a fee. And so when you put in that fee aspect of it, you also then have to have a legal aspect, and you're going to bring lawyers into the mix. So every time that you have a trustless transaction, you bring more parties into the mix, and you're not trusting those parties either. Instead, they become de facto trustees or trustors, and those transactions become slow, cumbersome, and expensive. For you to buy a simple item online, they have to verify your credit card before you process, that you have enough money in the account. Then they ship, then they charge your credit card. So there's those holes on your credit cards, or there's the need to use an escrow account or use a custody provider. Those are the parts that we're trying to remove from transactions and make them more seamless, integrated, and faster by providing trust. And we see blockchain as the way to provide trust natively. Instead of having using the middleman, you're able to every individual is able to transact peer-to-peer. And so in a peer-to-peer flat network, you're able to remove those corporations or those hierarchy-driven organizations where there's a single part of failure at the top. And I think a lot of people are paying attention to some of the misgivings that have happened recently where someone's decision is leading to compromisation of data or misuse of data. And so by allowing you to track one-on-one with an individual, you're able to build that trust relationship, even in a trustless environment. By having a blockchain component in there, you have a smart contract, and that smart contract is going to drive how the transaction works, and the blockchain is going to prove that it happened as planned. So we see investing in companies through the EOS VC program as finding those early stage companies of a great developing team that is building a trustless environment that allows you to transact online. So that's really been our focus on how to bring trust to the mass market, is identifying those early stage candidates that improve the regular day of life.
Thanks, Brian. Let's just talk a little bit more about that. I was in London a couple of weeks ago at London Blockchain Week, and they were talking about the move to global self-regulating economies. So can you just touch a little bit more on the transaction issue and new and innovative ways that trust can improve slow, cumbersome, expensive transactions? Because these global self-regulating economies will only happen if you can solve that problem.
Sure. I think it's easiest to start off with an example. There's a company I really like called MakerOS, based in Chicago, part of the EOSVC program. They're taking a very simple process. As I mentioned, purchasing something online. So every product you have, whether it's digital or physical, you have to go through the same steps of the idea has to become a design, that design then has to be prototyped, and that prototype then has to be produced. You're going to interact with no less than 5 people in that transaction. You're going to have the custody of the money, you're going to have the legal, and what MakerOS has done in a very much smaller scale than global government economies is you're able to have a trustless system. So each player steps up and submits their work into this blockchain smart contract on a blockchain, and the transaction happens natively. You don't have to have other third parties being brokered in or transacting. It's an end-to-end system for management of this process. And I think having these use cases that, while it's still small, if you're trying to prototype a 3D printed object and you're able to use the designer in China and have the printer in Chicago and you being based in Florida, you're all three able to interact in real time. You don't have to wait for someone to review the legal document, confirm that the money was received, because I think most people here have dealt with a wire transfer or done a trade online. And what's funny is banks do the trading happens in milliseconds. However, the settlements take several days, and that's always been a frustrating part. So as banks and governments move away from the slow settlement process, seeing the example of such as MakerOS, where you're able to do that transaction in a blink of an eye, and everything's done and everything's secure in a new trust environment, governments will most likely and hopefully look at those scenarios and then implement them on a more global scale.
Yeah, and it's not just going to be transactions, it's going to be supply chains and insurance and a whole lot of other sectors. So one of the things that we know and we've heard is that public blockchains require mass adoption. They require a lot of people to be building on them. So just in terms of your experience, how have the developers shifted their focus in the last 6 months? What are the devs who are building on your blockchain doing?
Sure. I think the last 6 months, people talk usually about different topics. I usually focus on the blockchain software. I think the last 6 months has given the opportunity for developers that were already developing on blockchain, as well as developers on other ecosystems, to look to blockchain as a way of solving these really small problems. We see a lot of teams that are building great products that are just pain points in your everyday life. Also with banking, there's another company that Galaxy Digital invested in through their EOSVC fund called Good Money. And so that's banking. Everyone here deals with banking on a regular basis, and this team is building a process that it's integrating on a mass scale the users into the blockchain. So instead of, you inherently don't trust certain players, whether it be your bank or your credit card, because you don't know where that money's going, or you don't think it's fair, or you weren't disclosed what was happening. With Good Money, their premise is that that's all disclosed up front and there are no fees. So instead of them making money on your money, you actually get rewarded for doing the banking. So I think that iteration of having trust in where you're working and having a giant blockchain through like Good Money, which is building on EOS.io, is a great way to start that process. So I think banking someone that everyone's familiar with, everyone may have frustrations with, and solving those frustrations at the beginning will push for the mass adoption.
So help me a little bit, just in terms of trying to understand, because people say blockchain's secure, it's trusted, it's immutable, it's got all of these great features, but how is security different than trust?
Sure. It's like looking back at the start of blockchain. If you really get into the meat of like why blockchain started, it was all about trust. Security was a byproduct of that trust, where you have the data in a secure environment that can only be accessed with keys. That allowed you to secure it, but the trust was really what we were trying to accomplish, what was trying to be accomplished with blockchain. So the difference is that you could have secure data many different ways, but just because you have security in the tightest vault doesn't mean you trust it. The vault still has a code on it, and you still have to not share that key. So having security doesn't equal trust in that sense. Trust is where you can have your data floating on a public blockchain, but you know it's secure. The trust is that you know that that blockchain is loyal to the smart contract, loyal to the coding, and it's decentralized, where if there's a bad actor out there, you know it can't be misused. Because even in the most secure environment, we think a lot of our online accounts are secure, but as Larry mentioned earlier, there's hacks after hacks or breaches that may not be found out till later. Those were secure, but you didn't trust them. And I think when you add in the trust aspect of building a blockchain, the security is native, but the trust is what you're really going for.
Okay, so let me challenge you for a few predictions, Brian. Get them out there. So which sectors do you think are going to benefit the most from this? Which ones do you think will go fastest? And when are we going to see it at scale?
Sure. To start, I think we're really on the cusp of starting to see mass adoption. Again, going off what Larry mentioned from Everpedia, was we really want to see that mass adoption. I think there's, as I mentioned, some smaller applications out there that are starting the process of building things that are going to be on your phone in the near future. One of the ways that I see that happening is through NFTs, so non-fungible tokens. There's a standard out there put out by John Linden, formerly of Call of Duty, now at Mythical Games, and he's put together a standard of non-fungible tokens. Because when you're playing those games, you always trusted that the developer of these video games would continue the game on. But you know, they're loyal to shareholders and increasing revenues. And when you have these games that you were passionate about playing, and they came out with version 2, everything you had done in the first version was lost. And I think that loss of trust, where you no longer believed in the manufacturers of the game, really hurt people. People moved away from gaming, and that's why mobile gaming grew. But with D-goods and NFT tokens, I think it allows you to have your value and move it between games. So I think that will be probably, gaming will be the first iteration that's going to be mass adoption. The overlap between developers of blockchain dApps were originally gamers back in the day, in their younger years. So I think that overlap really is going to be where you're going to see a lot of the focus. So whether it's Mythical Games or another company like High Fidelity building a VR space where it's communal VR, you're really going to see that adoption. And with that, I think it's just going to transcend into banking and financial services and legal from there.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So you must see a lot of, you and the EOS VC team must see a lot of companies. So other than MakerOS, what other companies have you seen with EOS VC that you think are going to be really strong in building that kind of trust in transactions?
Sure. Obviously, MakerOS I think is great. I mentioned Good Money, the banking platform. I think some other great ones are going to be companies that are native to solving those little problems. Some examples are social media. So there's a few social media companies out there that are building pretty quickly, and I think like when they're ready to launch and get out there, I think you're going to feel a lot more comfortable using them. So I think those games are really important. In addition, for HR hiring, there's always that gray area when you're doing hiring and building that process. And so there's a great company in Germany called Instafo, and they're building to solve that problem. And I think when you have trust in a transaction that everyone's doing on a regular basis, and you bring it back to having not just secure data but trusted data, I think you're a lot more comfortable. So removing some of the hurdles in place, I think we're going to start seeing that influx in companies using the software. Traditional companies, not just new startups. I think more established companies will start pivoting and using it. But I think another great example is for time management for HR systems. It's shrinkage of time cards and wages is a known issue, and I think a lot of governments are looking at removing that risk. So when you go to work, you shouldn't have to trust that your employer is going to pay you a full wage. putting on a blockchain, making it immutable, you're not going to have to worry about that anymore. You're going to have your pay that you deserve without edits or corrections, as they call them. So I think that's going to be the start.
Yeah, I think the HR one's a really interesting one. A long time ago, I used to run hospitals, and it would take us months and months and months to credential the overseas trained doctors because we had to go back to the original institutions and get certified copies of their qualifications. And now people are producing products which will allow that to be locked onto the blockchain, and they can forever go back, and it's going to really reduce the time to hire. And the other application of that really interests me is around refugees and displaced people, because often people who are these displaced communities are well qualified, but they lose all of their transcripts in the movement and in the displacement, and this is going to enable them to much more quickly connect with their original qualifications. So it really has got some important applications. So we wanted to throw it out just to make sure you're not asleep out there in the audience. We wanted to give you a few minutes for some questions. So we'd love it if anyone's got questions or comments on this issue about trust in transaction, and it's fantastic to have Brian here to answer them.
Hi, my name is Shirley Xu. I'm actually speaking next panel, but I was curious about this trust thing. Nowadays, you see a lot of the OTC transactions totally based on no trust. So I'm glad that you're also producing something that will be getting a better trust in the transaction. So my question was about how do you verify, I guess initially, from your technology, from user base, user-friendly base of our previous speakers talking about, just getting the currency transaction folks to be comfortable with each other.
Could you repeat the last part?
The currency transactions.
Sure. I think with transaction with currencies and with OTC trading and overall trading, I think that there's that shift where there's a lot of experience, whether it's FX traders or Forex traders that have the frustrations that they've had in their current systems, and they're looking at implementing systems now that you have multiple parties verifying the information across several different platforms, and they're able to set the boundaries within the blockchain of what are what you would call legal in their environment based on laws and regulations. Like those laws and regulations are going to be put on the blockchain. So instead of having to design the smart contract on how to do the transaction, you're going to build those currencies on blockchain using those rails of security and using those security, the trust rails, and you're going to be able to have the currency build smart. And when you have those smart currencies, you're not going to have to worry about whether or not there's a bad actor, because the currency is going to be limited in what it can and cannot do. So there's no manipulation of the actual digital currency as you start building this ecosystem.
Thanks. I think we've got one more question down here in the front, Sam, and that's probably all the time we've got.
Oh, okay, yeah, there we go. Isn't it true blockchain can solve issues of trust that don't have to do with tokens, more like time-stamping, proof of existence, as well as decentralized file storage? And these things actually go way, way far beyond just transferring a value. They actually solve a lot of things that the original internet couldn't solve that should also be tackled. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think blockchain is, in its essence, is the most important part. The currency is a secondary. I think the blockchain, it's to show ownership. So you can show ownership of goods, you can show transactions. I think another example, when Jane had asked earlier where I see it going, I think concert tickets are going to be the next big one, where you own that concert ticket, but the forgeries out there is always a problem that everyone exists. Well, is this a real ticket or not? Having a blockchain solution, regardless of the token, doesn't need to be there. That's not going to be transferred to your wallet. You're going to still have a token, or in your phone have the QR code. It's going to be tied to a token in the network. That's just an asset account that the blockchain uses, basically the Excel sheet, but rather you're going to have that ownership. So every transaction that happens on the blockchain of that ticket passing from your hand to the next customer is verified. So that proof of ownership, I think, on the blockchain is really important. So the ticketing companies that are building, we're talking to a few right now for investments, and we think what they're doing is great. Also, the provenance of goods. So that's when you go into the physical space. We talk a lot about the the cryptocurrency trading or digital goods online or digital transactions or online transactions. I think moving blockchain into real-world applications and the provenance of good is going to be a major focus. I think a lot of the fashion designers and fashion houses are putting a lot of attention to this, where they have brand equity that they want to maintain, and they want to maintain that value across whether those bags or purses or shirts or shoes are sold from their retail store. They want to make sure that the customer who's buying them secondhand knows that it's true, and you're able to follow that. So we work with a team called Vero in New York, and they're building a great system where they're implementing technology that is not on blockchain, but the hash data is getting committed to the blockchain. So without that hash data, you can't replicate it. There's no way to replicate through their secret sauce how they're tracking the provenance of the goods through certain technologies. But we see that as the forefront. Like, that is going to be another integration that's going to happen. It takes a little while to integrate them into clothing and purses and shoes, but with that integration, you're going to be able to know that, have the confidence to buy and the trust in the reseller that it's real. You're not going to have to try to check the seams of the bags or anything like that. You're just going to know through a simple process, whether it's a phone or not, that it's real and it can't be replicated. So that hash data, I think, on the blockchain, as you were mentioning, Sam, is very important to the success.
Yeah, provenance is a really important use case, and you've got Everledger working on provenance of blood diamonds, and you've got Provenance working with Tesco's on the provenance of their food, and Fairchain working on the provenance of Ethiopian coffee. So there's a tremendous lot of applications. So Brian, time's up. The screen is screaming to us. It's just fantastic that you've given some time up today to share your experience and ideas with the audience. Thanks so much, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Brian and Jane, for sharing their insights on transactions and trust.